Welcome to Warriors of the World. Today we'll be exploring the extraordinary life of Nakano Takeko, the female samurai who led an all-women combat unit in Japan's last civil war. Subscribe now to join our community and support this project. Now, let's begin. Japan, 1847. While the Western world was experiencing the Industrial Revolution, the land of the rising sun remained largely isolated, firmly controlled by the Tokugawa shogunate that had ruled for more than 2 centuries. Into this world of rigid traditions and impending change was born a girl named Nakano Takeko, in the Joshu region, present-day Gunma Prefecture. What makes Takiko's story so remarkable is that she was born during what Japanese historians call Bakumatsu, the final turbulent years of the Tokugawa shogunate. Foreign ships were appearing with increasing frequency in Japanese waters, challenging the nation's self-imposed isolation. Internal tensions were growing between those loyal to the shogun and those who sought to restore power to the emperor. Few historical sources document Takiko's early childhood, but we know from family records preserved in the Aizu region that she was the daughter of Nakano Heinai, a lower-ranked samurai official serving the Aizu domain, and his wife Koko. According to the Aizu Women's War Chronicles, compiled in the late 19th century, Takeko showed exceptional intelligence from an early age. Her father, progressive for his time, recognized her abilities and ensured she received education typically reserved for boys. Professor Yamakawa Kiku, whose family knew the Nakanos and who later documented women's roles in the Aizu War, notes that Takiko's childhood coincided with increasing social unrest. Food shortages, peasant uprisings, and natural disasters all contributed to an atmosphere of societal instability. These conditions would ultimately shape Takiko's destiny in ways no one could have predicted. It's worth noting that Takiko's upbringing was unusual even for a samurai daughter. Most girls from samurai families were primarily educated in domestic arts like sewing, flower arrangement, and tea ceremony, the essential feminine virtues contained in instructional texts like Ana Daigaku, Greater Learning for Women. While Takeko did learn these skills, her education extended far beyond the typical boundaries for young women of her era. As historian and Walthall notes in her study, The Weak Body of a Useless Woman, this period saw rare opportunities for certain women to step outside traditional gender roles, especially in domains like Aizu where ancient warrior traditions remained strong. For a girl with Takiko's spirit and intelligence, the tumultuous times offered possibilities that would have been unthinkable in more stable eras. At age 6, something extraordinary happened that would shape Takiko's future. She was sent to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, to study under Akaoka Daisuke, a renowned martial arts instructor and classical scholar. This opportunity came through her father's connections and represented an almost unprecedented chance for a girl to receive formal warrior training. According to Akaoka's student records, partially preserved at the Aizu Wakamatsu Historical Museum, Takeko quickly distinguished herself in both academic studies and martial training. She mastered classical Chinese literature, calligraphy, and mathematics alongside the art of the naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade traditionally associated with female warriors. The naginata was considered particularly suitable for women because its length compensated for a female fighter's typically shorter height and lesser upper body strength when facing male opponents with swords. Historical records from the dojo indicate that by her teenage years, Takeko had become so proficient with the naginata that she could defeat most male students in practice bouts. What's particularly fascinating is that Takiko's education took place during a period when Neo-Confucian ideals that strictly limited women's roles were theoretically at their strongest in Japanese society. However, as military historian Stephen Turnbull has documented, there remained a competing tradition of the onabugeisha, or female martial artist in certain samurai families, particularly in domains like Aizu that prided themselves on maintaining ancient traditions. By age 16, Takeko had become an accomplished martial artist and intellectual. According to her sister Yuko's later testimonies, collected by local historian Yamakawa in the 1880s, Takeko had also developed strong opinions about women's capabilities that were radical for her time. She reportedly stated that the soul of a warrior knows no gender, a sentiment that directly challenged prevailing social norms. In 1863, her formal education complete, Takeko returned to her family, who had relocated to the Aizu domain. There, she took up a position as an instructor at the Aizu clan's martial arts school, teaching the daughters of other samurai families. As noted in the Aizu domain's employment records, she also worked as a lady-in-waiting at Tsuruga Castle, home to the daimyo, Lord Matsudaira Katamori, where she taught naginata techniques to the women of the castle. One particularly telling anecdote recorded by her contemporaries describes how a visiting samurai from another domain scoffed at the idea of women's martial training. Takeko allegedly challenged him to a practice duel and, using her naginata, disarmed him in seconds. While such stories may contain elements of legend, they speak to Takeko's growing reputation as an exceptional female warrior during a time when such women were increasingly rare. To understand Takeko's ultimate fate, we must understand the monumental changes sweeping through Japan during her lifetime. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853, when Takeko was just 6 years old, had shattered Japan's isolation and forced the Tokugawa shogunate to sign unequal treaties with Western powers. This foreign intrusion triggered a domestic crisis. The rallying cry of "Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians," gained popularity among many samurai, particularly from domains that had long resented Tokugawa rule. Historical records from the imperial court, now preserved in the National Archives of Japan, reveal growing tension between the shogunate and forces loyal to Emperor Komeei. The Aizu domain, where Takeko now lived, found itself in a precarious position. Lord Matsudaira Katamori, as the military governor of Kyoto, was tasked with protecting the imperial capital from anti-shogun forces. According to domain records studied by historian Hoshi Ryoichi, Aizu became known as one of the shogunate's most loyal supporters, a position that would eventually lead to disaster. By 1868, after years of growing tension, the situation exploded into open conflict. The newly enthroned young emperor Meiji issued an imperial decree abolishing the shogunate. Tokugawa forces were defeated in the battles of Toba Fushimi, and the new imperial government declared the Aizu domain to be enemies of the court for their continued loyalty to the shogunate system. As contemporary accounts collected in the Records of the Restoration detail, this pronouncement was essentially a death sentence for the domain. Imperial forces, equipped with modern Western weapons and military tactics, prepared to march north to crush Aizu. The domain's samurai, though skilled in traditional combat, were outmatched in terms of firepower and numbers. For Takeko, now 21 years old, these political developments were not abstract concerns but immediate threats to everything and everyone she held dear. According to letters preserved by her family, she recognized that the coming conflict would be unlike traditional feudal battles. This would be a fight for survival against a modernizing force determined to erase the old ways, including the samurai tradition she embodied. As imperial forces prepared their march northward in September 1868, Aizu faced an existential threat. The domain's leaders debated whether to surrender or resist, knowing that resistance likely meant annihilation. According to council records quoted by historian Shiba Goro in his memoir, Remembering Aizu, Lord Matsudaira's advisors were divided, but the samurai class overwhelmingly supported fighting to the end rather than surrendering their honor. For Takeko and other women of Aizu's samurai families, this crisis would soon demand extraordinary courage and sacrifice. As one female survivor later told historian Yamakawa, "We knew the men might all die in battle. We prepared ourselves to defend our homes and, if necessary, to die with dignity rather than face dishonor." As imperial forces approached Aizu in late 1868, a remarkable development occurred that would secure Nakano Takeko's place in history. According to accounts compiled by surviving participants and preserved in the Aizu Wakamatsu Historical Museum, Takeko proposed the formation of an all-female combat unit to support Aizu's defense. This unit became known as the Joshitai, literally, Women's Corps. It included between 20 to 30 women, primarily daughters of samurai families, ranging in age from teenagers to women in their 30s. What made this unit extraordinary was that unlike other cases where women took up arms as a last resort when their castle was already under attack, the Joshitai was a deliberately formed combat unit that planned to meet the enemy on the battlefield. The formation of this unit represents something truly unique in Japanese history. As military historian Thomas Conlon notes in his study of samurai warfare, while individual female warriors, onabugeisha, had existed throughout Japanese history, an organized all-female fighting unit was unprecedented. The women who joined were making a conscious decision to fight and likely die for their domain. Takeko's sister Yuko, who survived the war and lived until 1904, provided detailed accounts of the unit's formation. According to her testimony, collected by local historian Yamakawa Kiku, most of the women had received at least some training in naginata techniques, as this was still part of the education for daughters of samurai families in conservative Aizu. However, Takeko took charge of providing additional combat training in the days before battle. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield, including recovered weapons and armor fragments, confirms that the women prepared seriously for combat. Most fought with naginata, but some also carried kaiken, female daggers, and tanto, short swords, for close combat. Unlike male samurai, they did not have formal battle armor, instead improvising with pieces of armor bound over their traditional clothing. What motivated these women to form a combat unit? According to letters and diaries preserved from several members, multiple factors were at play. Practical defense of their homes was certainly one motivation. The women knew what had happened to civilian populations in other domains that had opposed imperial forces. But equally important was the concept of samurai honor. As one member, Yamamoto Yeiko, wrote in a letter discovered in the 1930s, "If the men of Aizu fight to the death for their lord and their honor, should the women do any less? Our blood carries the same samurai spirit." This sentiment reflects the deep commitment to Bushido, the way of the warrior, that characterized Aizu's culture. The formation of the Joshitai also reveals something important about Takiko's leadership abilities. That she could organize, train, and inspire such a unit in the midst of crisis speaks to her charisma and the respect she commanded. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing the soul of a warrior in a woman's body, and note that even established male samurai treated her with deference unusual for a woman of the period. By October 1868, imperial forces had surrounded the Aizu domain and began their assault on Aizu Wakamatsu Castle, also known as Tsuruga Castle. The castle was one of the strongest in northern Japan, but it faced an overwhelming force equipped with modern Western firearms and even artillery pieces. According to battlefield reports compiled by both sides, the fighting began on October 8 near the town of Yanagawa, just outside Aizu Wakamatsu City. It was here that Nakano Takeko and her Joshitai would make their stand and enter the pages of history. The imperial forces, primarily composed of samurai from the Satsuma and Chashu domains, modern Kagoshima and Yamaguchi prefectures, advanced with superior numbers and weaponry. Archaeological excavations at the battle site have uncovered bullet casings from imported Western rifles, contrasting with traditional weapons used by many Aizu defenders. According to accounts collected from survivors and imperial army reports, the Joshitai positioned themselves at a strategic checkpoint in Yanagawa. When imperial troops encountered this unusual all-female unit, they reportedly hesitated, uncertain how to engage women in battle, a hesitation that the Joshitai used to their advantage in the initial clash. What happened next has become legendary in Japan. Takeko, leading from the front, charged into the imperial forces with her naginata. According to the official record of the Imperial Army's 2nd Regiment, preserved in Japan's National Archives, the women fought with unexpected ferocity and managed to break through the first line of imperial troops. Eyewitness accounts, later collected by historian Yamakawa, described Takeko as a whirlwind of steel, cutting down multiple opponents as she led her unit deeper into the enemy formation. One imperial soldier who survived the encounter wrote in his diary, discovered in 1953, that the women fought with a desperation and skill that put many male warriors to shame. However, the technological advantage of the imperial forces eventually proved decisive. As the close-quarters combat continued, Takeko found herself facing troops armed with modern rifles. According to multiple accounts, including reports from the imperial side, she had already cut down 5 or 6 opponents when a bullet struck her in the chest. Knowing that death was imminent and fearing that her body would be taken as a trophy by the enemy, a common practice in samurai warfare, Takeko reportedly asked her sister Yuko to cut off her head. This act, known as kaishaku, was a form of battlefield mercy that preserved the warrior's dignity. According to Yuko's later testimony, she fulfilled this final request and carried her sister's head from the battlefield. The remaining members of the Joshitai continued fighting but were eventually forced to retreat toward the castle. Historical records indicate that about half of the unit perished in this engagement, with survivors joining the defense of the castle itself or helping to evacuate civilians. While Takeko fell at Yanagawa, the battle for Aizu continued. The surviving members of the Joshitai retreated to Tsuruga Castle along with other Aizu forces. According to castle defense records preserved at the Aizu Wakamatsu Museum, the siege that followed was one of the most desperate last stands in Japanese history. Imperial forces surrounded the castle and began bombardment with artillery, modern weapons against which the traditional fortress had little defense. Within days, fires had broken out in multiple sections of the castle, and food supplies began running dangerously low for the thousands of defenders and civilians sheltering inside. The women of Aizu, including surviving Joshitai members, took on multiple roles during the siege. Archaeological evidence and eyewitness accounts confirm that they helped treat wounded soldiers, extinguished fires caused by artillery shells, prepared food from increasingly scarce supplies, and in some cases continued to fight when sections of the outer wall were breached. Perhaps the most tragic episode occurred among the women of the ruling Matsudaira family and their attendants. According to accounts by survivors, collected in Women of the Mito Domain by historian Yamakawa Kiku, when it seemed the castle would fall, 22 women and children gathered in the garden of the residence. Believing that defeat meant dishonor worse than death, they committed mass ritual suicide, jigai, the female equivalent of seppuku. Only one young girl survived, found unconscious among the bodies by imperial troops who finally breached the castle on November 6. Her testimony, recorded decades later, provides one of the most heart-wrenching accounts of the psychological reality of samurai values when pushed to their ultimate conclusion. The castle's lord, Matsudaira Katamori, had been fighting elsewhere and survived. Against expectations, the imperial government did not execute him but instead confined him to house arrest. This relative leniency was denied to many lower-ranking samurai of Aizu, however, with numerous executions carried out and many families exiled to barren northern territories as punishment for their treason against the emperor. For the surviving women of the Joshitai, including Takiko's sister Yuko, the defeat meant the end of the world they had known. The samurai class itself was soon abolished by imperial decree, with former samurai forbidden to wear swords or identify themselves by their former status. Within a generation, the warrior culture that had defined Japan for centuries was officially erased. As historian Sato Hachiro notes in his study, The Last Samurai Women, many survivors struggled to adapt to Japan's rapid modernization. Some former female warriors became teachers, while others married and raised children who would grow up in a Japan racing toward industrialization and westernization. The Meiji government, eager to project an image of civilized modernity to Western powers, actively suppressed stories of female combatants like the Joshitai for several decades, considering them emblematic of the backward feudal system they were replacing. After Takiko's death on the battlefield, her sister Yuko carried her head to the Hokai Temple in Aizu. According to temple records and local tradition, preserved by the temple's priests through generations, Takiko's head was buried with honor, and a monument was erected at the site. This act itself was significant in samurai culture. Proper burial of the head, considered the seat of the soul, was essential for honoring a fallen warrior. That Takiko received this treatment speaks to the respect she had earned as a true samurai, regardless of her gender. For decades following the Meiji Restoration, official histories minimized or ignored the role of women in the conflicts. However, in local Aizu tradition, the story of Takiko and her Joshitai remained alive through oral histories and private family records. The first scholarly attention came in the early 20th century from female historians like Yamakawa Kiku, whose family had connections to the Nakanos. Her research, compiled in Women of the Mito Domain, 1910, and Women of the Aizu War, 1926, included interviews with survivors and family members, preserving first-hand accounts that would otherwise have been lost. The preservation of Takiko's story is remarkable when we consider that it ran counter to both the traditional Confucian view that women's deeds were unworthy of historical record and the Meiji government's desire to portray Japan as a modern nation where women were demure and domestic, in keeping with Western Victorian ideals. Archaeological excavations at battle sites around Aizu Wakamatsu in the 1950s and 1960s uncovered physical evidence that corroborated accounts of the women's combat unit, including distinctive naginata damage patterns on bones recovered from mass graves of imperial soldiers and personal items identified as belonging to Joshitai members. Takiko's monument at Hokai Temple survived various challenges, including World War II bombing that damaged many historical sites and gradually became a place of pilgrimage. Local residents maintained the site even during periods when samurai heritage was politically problematic, demonstrating the deep impression Takiko's courage had made on regional identity. In 1926, as Japan entered a period of militarism and renewed interest in samurai traditions, Aizu established an annual memorial ceremony for Takiko on the anniversary of her death. According to temple records, this ceremony has been performed every year since, with only a brief interruption during the American occupation following World War II. The ceremony includes traditional Shinto and Buddhist elements, with young women from local martial arts schools performing naginata demonstrations in Takiko's honor. This living tradition has helped ensure that her story passed to new generations even when it wasn't included in official history textbooks. In contemporary Japan, Nakano Takeko has been rediscovered as an important historical figure, part of a broader re-evaluation of women's roles in Japanese history. This renewed interest began in earnest during the post-war period, particularly as feminist scholarship emerged in Japanese academia during the 1970s and 1980s. At Hokai Temple today, Takiko's monument has been expanded into a small memorial park. According to visitor records maintained by the temple, approximately 15,000 people visit annually, including many young women interested in Japan's martial heritage. The temple now includes a small museum with artifacts related to the Joshitai, including a naginata believed to have belonged to one of the unit's members. In the city of Aizu Wakamatsu, Takeko is now embraced as a local hero and tourist attraction. A statue depicting her in combat was erected near the rebuilt Tsuruga Castle in 1993. According to city tourism statistics, sites associated with Takeko and the women of Aizu have become particularly popular with female visitors from throughout Japan and abroad. Educational materials have also evolved significantly. A review of Japanese history textbooks by education researcher Tanaka Michiko shows that while Takeko was entirely absent from school texts before 1970, by 2000 she was included in most middle and high school history books, albeit briefly. More detailed treatment appears in supplementary materials focused on women's history. Modern naginata martial arts associations explicitly claim Takeko as part of their heritage. The All Japan Naginata Federation, which has over 50,000 members, predominantly female, includes the story of Takeko and the Joshitai in their official materials. According to Federation surveys, many young practitioners cite Takeko as an inspiration for taking up the art. Popular culture has also embraced Takeko's story. She has been portrayed in historical novels, manga, anime series, and even video games. The 2013 NHK Taiga drama Yae no Sakura featured Takeko as a secondary character, introducing her to a national television audience of millions. Film historian Tanaka Kinuyo notes that these portrayals vary in historical accuracy but have collectively raised awareness of female samurai beyond academic circles. What's particularly interesting about Takeko's modern legacy is how it transcends political boundaries. She has been claimed as a hero by Japanese feminists seeking examples of women who defied gender limitations, by conservatives who admire her embodiment of traditional loyalty and sacrifice, and by martial arts practitioners who respect her technical skill and discipline. In 2018, for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Aizu, the Japanese government officially recognized the battlefield at Yanagawa as a site of national historical importance. The designation document specifically mentions Takeko and the Joshitai, marking a complete reversal from the Meiji government's effort to erase them from history. While Nakano Takeko has become an iconic figure, it's worth examining what we know about her as a person beyond her final battle. Historical records provide glimpses of a complex individual whose life was cut short before she could fully realize her potential. According to her sister Yuko's recollections, preserved in the Yamakawa family archive, Takeko was known for her intellect as much as her martial skill. She was an accomplished classical scholar who read and wrote Chinese, composed poetry, and studied historical military texts. This combination of physical and intellectual prowess made her unusual even among educated samurai women. Personal letters that survived the war reveal her thoughts on gender roles. In one particularly telling document, preserved at the Aizu Museum, she wrote to a fellow female martial artist, "The naginata is not merely a weapon but a way to train the spirit. Whether wielded by man or woman, it demands the same discipline and reveals the same truths." This perspective, that martial arts transcended gender, was radical for Tokugawa-era Japan. Archaeological evidence offers physical insights into Takeko's life. Items recovered from the family residence include her writing box with calligraphy tools, suggesting an active intellectual life. Analysis of a kimono fragment believed to be hers indicates a woman of average height for the period, approximately 150 centimeters, but with unusually developed musculature in the arms and shoulders, consistent with years of naginata training. Regarding her personal appearance, contemporary descriptions collected by historian Yamakawa Kiku suggest Takeko did not conform to traditional beauty standards of the era. She kept her hair shorter than was customary for women, wore simpler clothing that allowed freedom of movement, and had a direct manner of speaking that some found disconcerting in a woman. One fascinating aspect of Takeko's life was her apparent rejection of marriage. According to family records, she received multiple marriage offers from samurai families impressed by her accomplishments, but she declined them all. In Tokugawa, Japan, such a choice was extremely unusual and would have required significant personal conviction and likely family support. Her relationship with her father appears to have been crucial in enabling her unconventional life. Court documents from the Aizu domain show that Nakano Heinai held progressive views on women's education, possibly influenced by his own studies of ancient Japanese texts that contained stories of female warriors. That he allowed and encouraged his daughter's martial development represents a significant departure from typical paternal behavior of the period. Takiko's decision to form and lead the Joshitai reveals much about her character. As military historian Kawana Tetsuzan notes in his analysis of the Aizu campaign, organizing an effective combat unit during a crisis requires not just courage but leadership skills, tactical understanding, and the ability to inspire others to follow into extreme danger, qualities Takeko clearly possessed. Perhaps most telling is how she was remembered by those who knew her. Accounts from students she taught at the Aizu Domain's martial school, collected decades after her death, consistently describe her as demanding but inspiring, someone who pushed women to exceed the limitations society placed on them. The story of Nakano Takeko resonates in our modern world for reasons that transcend her dramatic final battle. Her life and choices continue to offer relevant insights across cultural and temporal boundaries. First, Takeko challenges simplistic narratives about historical gender roles. As gender studies scholar Ueno Chizuko notes in her analysis of samurai women, traditional Western views of Japanese women as universally submissive and domestic fail to account for figures like Takeko. Her existence reminds us that historical reality was always more complex than stereotypical portrayals suggest. For modern martial artists, Takeko represents the principle that combat arts are about mental discipline as much as physical technique. Martial arts instructor Tanaka Kinuyo, who teaches naginata in Tokyo, explains, "When we tell students about Takeko, we emphasize that her greatest strength was not in her arms but in her spirit. That principle remains the core of true martial arts practice today." Historians find in Takeko an important case study of resistance to cultural transition. As Japan scholar Thomas Harper observes, the Aizu domain's stand, and Takeko's role in it, represents not just military resistance to the new imperial government but cultural resistance to the wholesale abandonment of traditional values in favor of rapid westernization. For leadership studies, Takeko offers an example of crisis leadership under extreme circumstances. Management professor Nishimura Yoko, who includes historical case studies in her executive training programs, uses the formation of the Joshitai to illustrate how effective leaders emerge during crises by combining technical competence with the ability to inspire collective action toward a meaningful purpose. Perhaps most significantly, Takeko matters because her story demonstrates the universal human capacity for courage and principle in the face of overwhelming odds. As philosopher Iguchi Tsunino writes in Reflections on Historical Heroism, stories like Takeko's remind us that the willingness to stand for one's beliefs, even at great personal cost, is not limited by gender, culture, or time period. In an era of renewed interest in women's historical contributions worldwide, Takeko offers a powerful counter-narrative to the assumption that women were always passive participants in history. Archaeological evidence, textual records, and oral histories collectively confirm that she and her fellow female warriors made conscious choices to fight for their beliefs and community. Today, the annual memorial ceremony at Hokai Temple includes young women from throughout Japan performing naginata demonstrations in Takeko's honor. According to the temple's abbot, Join Masahiro, many participants report that connecting with Takeko's legacy helps them find courage to face their own modern challenges. "They tell me that if Takeko could defy the limitations of her time," he says, "they too can overcome obstacles in their lives." As Japan continues to navigate questions of national identity, gender roles, and the balance between tradition and modernization, Nakano Takeko's brief but extraordinary life remains a reference point for multiple perspectives. The female samurai who led from the front, fought with distinction, and chose an honorable death rather than surrender continues to inspire reflection and admiration across ideological divides. Subscribe now, become a member, turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment so we can compare our knowledge and sources. Thank you for following our channel. Until our next strategic journey, here at Warriors of the World.